So what if I pitched you a film where the main character is nearly murdered by his stepdad, drowned in a bath, locked in a cellar, witnesses his wife get stabbed, and is raped by one of his friends? You'd probably say that my script needs some work, that the abundance of tragedies make the whole thing pretty laughable, on par with a bad student film. And yet all these tragedies befall David Platt from Coronation Street. Now, I'm not going to belittle David's pain here, he's obviously had a really horrendous life, but these examples are kind of typical of your average Coronation Street character. Any biography written for a Coronation Street character has a ridiculous number of problems and inconsistencies to the extent that you'd struggle to understand how anyone could take any of these characters seriously. And yet, the show works. It's a British institution, with many of its characters being recognisable to people who have never watched the show. This week I'm going to be looking at why this is the case, and get to the bottom of how, rather than collapsing under the weight of all its disparate story strands, Coronation Street, and soaps in general, manage to uphold a kind of internal logic that allows characters to grow and change. Long-standing television series inevitably get to a point where they begin to contradict themselves because, unlike most other forms of media, television is a form that relies on what is called an elastic narrative. When we're watching a film, we're typically watching a closed narrative. We have a beginning, middle, and end, and these all fit into a satisfying story, whereas television typically has two types of narratives laced through it. On the one hand, you have the broader, series-wide narrative, which links all of the episodes of the show together, and on the other hand, you have the narrative of the individual episode, which still has to provide a satisfying setup and conclusion. Oh, and by the way, I'm sure you'll give some examples of film series that employ elastic narratives, or television shows that are slow-burning singular narratives. Yes, you're absolutely correct, there are exceptions, but I'm speaking in a generalised fashion here to make a broader point about this specific show. As a soap, Coronation Street has a more sporadic form of storytelling. Individual episodes don't really have a beginning, middle and end. Rather, they present fragments of ongoing narratives that are being experienced by the characters from the street. Unlike other forms of television, these narratives don't cohere into a thematic whole, nor are they all in sync with one another. Whereas most shows present disparate narratives as attuned to one another, eventually they will all cohere into a satisfying whole. Soaps like Coronation Street have no endgame, and so do not need to do this. One story can start whilst another story is already in progress or nearing its conclusion, and often the different narratives will have shifting runtimes. Just think how long it took Pat Phelan's Reign of Terror to come to an end, in contrast to something like Sean's homelessness story, which only lasted a few weeks. Because of their seemingly indefinite runtime, soaps can stretch out character arcs for years or for minutes, depending on their popularity, and can adapt their narrative's outcomes to viewer tastes and reception. Moreover, because they feature large casts, soaps invariably need to employ a rotating emphasis on particular characters. Residents of the street can spend weeks at the centre of one of the show's biggest storylines, before becoming side characters again for a prolonged period of time, allowing other characters to once again take the spotlight. Just think about someone like Dev, who, 10 years ago, was involved in some of the show's most high-profile storylines. The fire at the Rovers, his marriage to Mad Maya, and his on and off relationship with Sunita. Nowadays, Dev is just sort of a background character. He owns a few businesses on the street, and can occasionally be counted on for the odd laugh. But he's not really present, is he? What's kind of cool about this, because Coronation Street employs an ever-changing cast, is that it's easy to push characters into and out of the limelight. Take for example Shane Ward joining the soap as Aidan, creating a love triangle between Eva and Maria. Characters who'd sort of been relegated to supporting players for a long time. Or a family like the Battersbys can leave, which creates a void for a comedy couple, ultimately resulting in Beth being introduced as a love interest for Kirk. I mean, her and Scylla look extremely similar. Though to be honest, I prefer Kirk and Beth. However, this chopping and changing of the spotlight can create problems. In a standard narrative, we see characters go on journeys, that's a given. But as soaps move characters in and out of the spotlight, it can often be the case that, taken on aggregate, the characters' lives begin to appear ridiculous. Take Tyrone Dobbs for example, a man who, over the years, has seen his wife father a child with another man before dying in a fire, has been involved in a lengthy domestic abuse storyline, has nearly been sent to prison, watched his girlfriend's daughter suffer from cancer, and become convinced that his daughter had inherited her mother's evil streak. If you don't think this show is insane, I don't know what is. Individually, these stories are effective micro-narratives, but over time they feel like student films. Patchy narratives with tragedy upon tragedy piled on top of them until they feel completely removed from reality. Coronation Street is supposed to be a show that is grounded in some sort of realism, but many of the characters have led ridiculous lives. Think about Peter Barlow pushing Billy over a cliff last year. This is a man who's been to prison, had numerous affairs, committed bigamy, and got into countless numbers of brawls. It just doesn't feel realistic. Or Peter's dad Ken, who's had hundreds of affairs. I mean, really? Are we actually going to pretend that this man isn't some sort of massive player? Now, I understand that characters are supposed to evolve as the show ages, but sometimes these changes are too sweeping and involve what amount to a retcon of character traits. Someone like Jenny, whose previous role in the series was as an antagonist, who psychologically manipulated Kevin Webster and become fixated on his son, Jack, culminating in her attempts to kidnap him, can be reintroduced after a year as a somewhat tragic character. We're supposed to somehow feel sorry for the way that Johnny treats her, despite the fact that she literally tried to kidnap a small child and was abusive towards Kevin's other children. This is very different to someone like Gemma or Becky entering as troubled characters who can later rehabilitate themselves. This is a complete flip of the script. All this would suggest that Coronation Street would be an incoherent mess, and yet it works. Why? Well, perhaps Mikhail Bakhtin might have the answer. He suggested that all texts are an assembly of a multitude of contradictory voices, all fighting for dominance. Any series of texts has parts that contradict one another, yet what holds them together are things that viewers consider to be the core tenets of the text, the essential essences that hold it together. For example, as we mentioned once before in our LEGO Star Wars 2 video, Batman is a character whose core essence suggests that he will never kill. There are numerous comics that contradict one another narratively, stories that overlap and don't cohere, but threaded across this is a core tenet, that he will never take another person's life. Well, unless you're Zack Snyder, then I guess you can do what you want because explosions are funny. Woohoo! Oh! Oh, look, he killed the guy. Oh, isn't this great? Oh, isn't this really, really close to the comic books? Don't you just feel that fidelity? Oh, isn't it great? I mean, in fairness, Tim Burton did get his Batman to kill, and Joel Schumacher got Val Kilmer and George Clooney to kill, and I guess Nolan did get Batman to kill as well. I mean, have any of them not killed? Anyway, as I've already established, Coronation Street doesn't have the same type of consistency. Characters frequently chop and change their characteristics depending on what fits the story. So what exactly holds the show together? Well, despite the fact the show's characters can display radical swings in their behaviour, what remains consistent across Coronation Street is the relationships between these characters. As a show which is built on neighbours knowing each other, Coronation Street's central focus is how the show's characters respond to each other in given situations, which means whilst individually they are readily malleable, the show explains itself away through suggesting that this is how a given character behaves when encountering another character. Let's use Pete Barlow again, for instance. On the current cast, Peter has had relationships with Leanne, Carla, and Toya, Leanne's sister. Within this dynamic, we often see Peter diametrically opposed to Leanne in a lot of situations concerning their son Simon. Often in these scenarios, Peter is portrayed as an antagonist, his inconsistent appearances in Simon's life clashing with the stability of Leanne's home life. In contrast, in his interactions with Toya, often in the same episode, he is suddenly the character that we are supposed to sympathise with, having been hurt by Toya's lies. And yet, again, we're supposed to see Peter as a villain in his recent storyline with Carla, tempting her back into their relationship, despite it being self-destructive. This isn't a sudden, slow burn narrative that gradually evolves. The roles these characters inhabit literally jump and flip in the same episode. What keeps it all coherent is that these characters' relationships are so established that it's almost like channel hopping when we see the characters talk to one another. When Peter talks to Carla, this is a separate narrative strand to his interactions with Leanne. Because Coronation Street encompasses a variety of sprawling, disconnected narratives, it's impossible to view it as one piece of writing. Instead, it's an umbrella term which all these stories fall under. So if we view Peter's storyline with Leanne as literally separate to his story with Toya or Carla, then Peter's contradictory position as both antagonist and protagonist can be resolved. These stories occur on the same street at the same time, but in essence, they might as well be happening in a wholly different reality. They're separate anecdotes altogether. In this sense, Coronation Street's cohesiveness comes from the fact that, by definition, as a soap which encompasses multiple disparate narrative strands, there is no audience expectation for anything to cohere into one singular narrative. Rather, the street functions as a location through which multiple stories can be told simultaneously. To understand the key to the show's success, it's important to recognise that the street is essentially a means through which we can force different characters to interact and begin new stories. A changeover in Rover's staff, for example, can create whole new dynamics when things kick off in the pub. Whoever moves next to Gail or Sally will invariably have to forge a relationship with them. By exploiting the malleability of this, the show continues to be an unquestionable success, and it is easy to see, like I said at the beginning, why it has become such a British institution. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you'd like to see more from Full Fat videos, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can see our social media links down below if you want to follow us on things like Twitter. And thank you very much to all our patrons. If you would like to join our Patreon, the link is in the description. We will see you next week.